And we're back with you here on Fight TV. Hi, everybody. Tony Schiavone and Sean Mooney in the final day of StarCast 2. And what a weekend this has been.
Yeah, it's been awesome. And I could get used to this, Tony. You and I back together again. It's been a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
We slid right back in.
That's right.
Just right back in. And I got to tell you.
Okay.
You guys were fabulous there in the Something to Wrestle With final show.
The final show?
Maybe not.
You know it's pro wrestling, right?
Yes.
So you never say final.
That's right.
That's
Anything
right.
can happen. But it has been a tremendous 4 days here in Las Vegas. Look at this crowd. We've got more great live shows. These folks, you all set for this next great offering we have here from StarCast 2? Yeah.
Yeah. Our next offering is about the great Brian Pillman. It's called Crazy Like a Fox. Liam O'Rourke, who is the author of that book, is going to be out here as well. And some of the people who were instrumental in his career will be out here, like Kevin Sullivan is going to be here, and we're going to hear from his son, Brian Pillman Jr. as well.
Yeah, I believe one of his gimmicks was loose cannon.
Right.
That was kind of described the kind of personality he was. But that's why he was so awesome. And he worked in just about every organization there could possibly be out there.
Right.
ECW, NWA, WWF. Just a tremendous personality.
He really was something special, Brian Pillman. And we're going to go to the stage here in just a moment. And don't forget, we have more to come here on Fight TV as well as we wrap up the final day here at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas of StarCast 2. And as you know by now, StarCast 3 is right around the corner in Chicago, and that is going to be during Labor Day weekend as well. Right now, here's the host of Crazy Like a Fox, Brian Pillman, the one and only Mark Madden.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that restrained, almost obligatory applause. Brian Pillman would have turned 57 earlier this week. And if I have a few emotional moments up here during the course of the next 90 minutes, please forgive me because I considered Brian one of my very closest friends. And the way that started was I wrote something about him in Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter. And he called me up, and I'm not sure I can imitate the gravelly voice, but he said, I really like that thing you wrote about me in Keller's dirt sheet. And then we started talking wrestling. So that's how Brian and I met by phone, a one-time phone call. Except it wasn't a one-time phone call. He just kept fucking calling. And that's in the best way possible, except it was always like at 2 or 3 in the morning, and he was wide awake and I was sound asleep. But if I didn't pick up the phone, it would just keep ringing. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And really, that could have been one of Brian's catchphrases. He never took no for an answer. And as I got to know Brian, it turned out he was a bit like Wile E. Coyote. He had all these crazy schemes and ideas that he wanted to see come to fruition, except they weren't that crazy. His ideas worked. He was a mad scientist. Think about this. For the best part of a year, maybe a bit longer, Brian Pillman worked the entire wrestling world. And he came out of it with the big money contract at the end. He played an end game that could have gone very badly, and Brian Pillman won. He was brilliant. That work, that con, was just unbelievable. He didn't even smarten me up. We're going to have a couple people up here in a minute that he did, but it was amazing. And I'll tell some of the stories about, actually I'll tell a few in just a moment, but knowing Brian is one of the singular most exciting experiences of my life, to be caught in his orbit, because that's what it was like. It was like quicksand. Once you're in, you're in. You couldn't get out, but you didn't want to get out in this case. It was just so enjoyable, and I miss Brian very much to this day. All the stories you've heard about Brian, they're all true. All of them. You hear stories about Brian Pillman, you think they can't be true? They are. He was nuts. When he was in college, his roommate was John Harbaugh, who's currently the coach of the Baltimore Ravens. Coach Harbaugh walked in on Brian suspended upside down in gravity boots, having sex with a woman. Brian called me once while having sex with Tammy Sitch. Sonny, not before, not after, during. And he did play-by-play. Some rather graphic play-by-play. Not only did he do that, he got Tammy to do color. Tammy had been imbibing whatever was her, choice intoxicant of the day. And near the end of the conversation, and I like Tammy, but what happened is what happened. She said, "My boyfriend's at home. I'm such a whore. I shouldn't be doing this." And then Brian grabs the phone. "Yeah, I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be doing this." Click. And then, of course, there's the time that Brian called me up. I was a writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for many years. And I covered Super Bowl 30, Steelers in Dallas at Tempe, Arizona. Brian calls me up the week before the game. "Hey, I got an idea." I'm going to do my normal voice so you can understand it. But he said, "I got an idea. I need you to give me your press pass. I'm going to run on the field." This is during his work, his free agency, his loose cannon thing. "I'm going to run on the field. I'm going to chain myself to the goalpost." Could you imagine the publicity that'll get? And I'm like, at 3 a.m, I'm like, "Yeah, Brian, that really would get a lot of publicity. It would also mean I couldn't report the game. It would also mean I'd lose my job. It would also mean I'd never work in the sports reporting industry again." There's like a 30-second pause, and Brian goes, "Listen, I can't be the only one making sacrifices." And we got a great group of people up here to talk about Brian. I'm going to enjoy this very much. Parts of it will be tough for all of us, I'm sure, but I just want to give you guys as much insight into the character of Brian Pillman and the kind of guy he was, the kind of performer he was, as I can, because, again, knowing him was a singular great experience in my life. To this day, and this is tough to say, every single time the phone rings late at night, I think it's Brian. And I always will. And one thing has to happen, though, and certainly the fans can get behind this. Brian Pillman needs to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Probably should have been a long time ago. And if I could pitch that to Vince McMahon and Paul Levesque and all those people, I'd say, "Listen, you guys need to put him in the Hall of Fame, because if you don't, there's a good chance he'll come back and pull a gun." Remember that? So thank you for listening to that drawn-out introduction. We have some great people to introduce now to come up and talk about Brian Pillman. First off, one of the greatest minds in pro wrestling history, a booker all over wrestling, but he was the key creative force during the period when Brian Pillman pulled his his work on the entire wrestling world. He was in on it, not many were. So let's welcome to the stage the guy who put me on TV, by the way, if you want to blame somebody. Let's welcome to the stage Booker Man, Kevin Sullivan. And finally, this is a real pleasure. He was on AEW's show last night in the Over the Budget Battle Royal. I just saw him for the first time since he was about 3 years old, moments ago. Boy, he looks so much like his father, it's scary. He's doing great things in MLW, Major League Wrestling, and I think he's going to make big impact in this industry. Let's welcome to the stage Brian Pillman Jr. Brian, I would prefer no more displays of athleticism for the rest of this. Don't run to the stage, please. You'll make us all look bad. By the way, forgive me if I refer to my notes because there's just so much to cover here. You guys all have microphones? You should. They're all up here.
Yeah, mic me up.
Kevin, you take that one. You guys split that one. Liam, we'll split this one.
Sure.
Bring microphones, please. Make it easy on us. And like, you know, anybody can jump in anytime they like. There's some questions we're going to refer to specific people. But I want to start with Brian's big moments because number one was him working everybody in 1995, which was amazing. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dave and Kevin. The only people who were truly in on it were you two and Kim Wood, who was Brian's strength and conditioning coach with the Cincinnati Bengals. Isn't that right?
I think you're right. And Eric.
And Eric, obviously, too, right. Dave?
I was only in halfway. After a while, when I halfway figured it out, he was like, "You don't have to tell people." And I go, "But I can't lie about it." But no, the actual story was that when him and Kim Wood concocted it, Brian went to Kim and just goes, "You know, what do we do about Dave?" And Kim goes, "Brian, you can't talk to Dave, you know, because you can't lie to him, but you can't confirm it." So I actually didn't hear from Brian for like, you know, a couple months. And then finally when it all got, then we were talking again all the time. But no, he didn't tell me ahead of time. It was like in the middle, when it was all going on, he avoided me.
Well, Liam, when you researched your book, is that your impression that those three people knew about it and pretty much nobody else?
The impression that I had was just from talking to various people was that, and this mostly came from Kim because he was completely invaluable to this book. He was absolutely awesome. As Dave knows, he's just a genius level intellect. He's a hilarious, brilliant guy. And as you say, he sat down at Kim Wood's kitchen table and they were talking about how they're going to get the value of his contract up because he was 33 years old. He wanted one big deal, well, as many big deals as he possibly could, but obviously he wanted to go to the next level in terms of pay. And the impression that I got from Kim was that the real underlying idea of the plan being to create the bidding war was really just Brian and Kim. And then eventually, I know that when Kim had said, you can't lie to Dave eventually because he's going to find out. I think that's the point where he probably kind of halfway told you what was going on as well, Dave.
Yeah.
But, and that was it. In terms of really knowing that it was the whole thing about manipulating the audience by doing things that for that period of time were taboo or things that were a little bit unusual in the industry, insider references and things like that. People who were smart, or thought they were smart, would think that it's real. But more than that, it was about kind of manipulating the guys as much as anything else and trying to get the talk and the buzz, because I think that the mentality was at the time that in this environment where he wants a pay rise on his contract, but the things that you would typically do to get a pay rise on your contract, like moving ratings, pay-per-views, things like that, he wasn't ever going to get the chance to do because he'd been slotted a little bit in WCW. So it's like, how do you create the illusion of value rather than actually being able to prove what your value is? And that was pretty much what it was. It was just manipulating the guys, manipulating everybody into talking about Brian, because the talk turns to value when the contract comes up.
Kevin, when you and Brian talked about this, obviously involving Eric, what were the conversations like? Where did this start? How did Brian pitch it? I know you liked the idea from the get-go, but expand on what happened. Tell that story.
Well, I'm going to correct you on one thing before we start about the chaining himself to the goalpost. He told me and Terry Funk, but you left one thing out. He was going to be naked, chained to the goalpost. That was Brian Pillman.
Thank you, Kevin.
That was Brian Pillman.
Thank you for clearing that up, Kevin.
Well, that would have got me even more fired.
And when Brian came to Eric and myself, it didn't take much to sell it, because Brian, like you said, was underutilized early. And during the rotation of the time with Jim Herd and stuff, he was kind of lost in the background. And when he pitched the idea to me, I thought it was brilliant. But he took it one step further, and I want to say this before I get in any further. When we lost Brian, we didn't just lose one of the greatest performers of all times. We lost one of the greatest would-have-been bookers of all times.
No question.
And the other thing is, you know, we talk about wrestling, Dave. We talk about great wrestling feuds that went on forever. Austin and him would have went on forever. They're still talking about the gun incident. They're still talking about Booker Man incident. And that was all Brian Pillman. And Brian and I used to call each other at night and talk about it because it would be funny. As the seriousness grew and the work grew, it started very slowly. And that's what he did perfectly. It wasn't like, you know, like today a guy's a heel and then all of a sudden he's a babyface. You could see Brian deteriorating mentally, and it was week by week by week. So when it got to when him and I were having friction, Eric started it by, he called a meeting in Orlando when we used to go down and do the tapings. And he said, Eric said that nobody's going to be late anymore, got to be on time, because the guys were, you know, lax coming to Orlando. It was hard to get in to the building. You had to show a permit and all that. And Brian said, is that including the Booker Man? And Eric said, you can leave if you want it. And he got up and left. So as the day goes on, Brian's still around. And I see guys going up to Brian down the hall. And they're saying to Brian, I'd like you to just slap the shit out of him. And Brian said, well, you know, I got to calm down. I got to calm down. That same guy would come up to me 10 minutes later and say, I hope you slapped the shit out of Pillman. But this is how brilliant that angle was. The biggest compliment I've ever got in the wrestling business, the WWF guys, Nash, Hall, the Click, bought that pay-per-view because they thought it was a shoot. And it was all Brian's ideas. I mean, I like to say that I might have thrown 2% in, but I'm not even that sure. He had it laid out perfectly, and it worked because everybody bought it. And I'm going to ask Dave this question. You know, Dean Ambrose?
Yeah.
I thought the biggest mistake they ever did with him was call him a loose cannon. How do you follow Brian Pillman?
Yeah.
You know, that's like saying, you know, the next Ted Williams. You know?
Yeah. Calling somebody Nature Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brian just had it perfectly. But the thing, again, I'm going to reiterate, was he didn't do it instantaneously. It was like all of a sudden we go to Europe, right? He'd be late for the bus, and he'd get on the bus and just sleep the whole way. He'd get into the building, and we couldn't find him. And then he'd be running in 2 minutes before the match, pulling on his tights. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody knew where he went. And people were saying, where is he? What's he doing? He's losing it. And it was a progression. And it took faith, I think, on Eric's part to let it go as long as he did. And Brian had a long leash, and I was for it because I saw money in it, because the guys bought that he was a loose cannon.
Well, let's talk about
He
some
was,
of the,
though.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, he was really Brian Pillman, and that's what's wrong with the wrestling business today. There's the characters they're forcing upon these young guys. That's not them, you know. And I'll ask you this question: would Dusty Rhodes have ever gotten a chance to talk?
Oh, you mean to talk like he talks now?
Yeah.
No, they'd be scripting everything, and
Yeah.
and yeah. Well, the last time Dusty was on, this is a different subject. The last time Dusty was on TV in WWE, he went impromptu, and they never put him on TV again. You know, so there you go.
Yeah.
well, right, and hopefully we see a different level of promos from AEW. I know they're doing bullet points, which is the way to go, and I think that's the way wrestling should have never left. Now, I want to talk about a few things that specifically that happened when Brian was doing this angle. And one was in January of 1996 at the Clash of Champions, where he was outside the ring during a match, and he grabbed Bobby Heenan around the neck. And Bobby had a bad neck, and Bobby yelled, "What the fuck are you doing?"
Yeah.
And he actually stormed off TV for a second.
Yeah.
Now, that was a shoot on Bobby's part.
Absolutely.
Bobby was legit pissed, and it added to the reality of what Brian was doing. Now, Kevin, how did that come about? Was that an ad-lib by Brian?
No, Brian came to me and I said, I am not going to condone this, but when you do it, don't grab his neck too hard. I said, I didn't say to do it, but when you grab his neck, make sure you don't snap it. And Brian what you said, when Bobby flipped. I mean, if you guys get a chance to go back and watch it.
It was so legitimate. He was so hot.
He was so hot.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he was so hot, and when he stormed off, I remember they told him to go back there, and he said, "Bullshit, I'm not going back there. That maniac may come back out again." And we had to talk him into going back out.
And another instance which involves you specifically, let's see when that was, the match between you and Brian at Super Bowl. It was supposed to be a respect match, and it ended how many seconds in when he just said, "I respect you, Booker man," and walked off. Just an amazing moment. And I talk to Brian every day, and at that point, even I'm wondering what the fuck's going on.
It was, Brian came up with the whole finish, and it was supposed to be a strap match.
Right.
It was supposed to be a strap match. And everybody was saying to me, you know, my friends like Arn and Rick were saying, "Hey, this guy's lost it. You better be careful out there." So we get ready to go out, and I yelled to Nick Patrick, the referee, "Where's the strap?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "How can we have a strap match without the strap? Where's the goddamn strap?" Excuse my language. He says, "I don't know." I said, "Well, they'll bring it out." I come out, and here comes Brian with the strap around his wrist and jumps on me and starts pounding me. And we had this figured out pretty good because we knew we had them hooked. And I told Brian, he came up with the idea, "I respect you, Bookman," but I said, "I'm going to have to lay one in on you." And I did lay it in, and he took it like a man, and everybody in the truck popped. You know, Craig
Everybody
Leathers,
backstage popped, too.
yeah, Craig Leathers said, "I knew he'd get him. I knew he'd get him." And then he did the thing about, "I respect you, Bookman." And then it just took off. I mean, he was flying Brian till that moment he became the loose cannon. And that was, to me, the final thing that put him over.
Liam, I'm going to ask you this in a second, but Dave, at that time, because you talked to, all the boys, I let the cat out of the bag. He talks to a lot of the boys, and certainly did then. But how many of the guys you talked to in all the promotions thought it was a shoot?
I think pretty much everyone thought at least some of it was. Everyone, because it's wrestling and you're all going to think if it's on TV, it's got to be a work. But most of the people thought that most of it was real, but it's like you're trying to figure, but this one wasn't, but this was. But as far as the idea of the heat between Brian and Kevin, I think pretty much everyone believed in every promotion that there was significant heat there, and it wasn't so much being turned into an angle, but playing off it. It was. I mean, the only one that I remember was Doug Furness, who of course is your friend.
Yeah.
And there was something where you attacked Brian, and I remember I was talking to Doug Furness, and you did something, you went after his eye, and I go, "Oh God, this is too serious," because I was only half and half at this point, right?
Yeah.
And Doug goes, "Kevin doesn't tackle like that," and he goes, "Kevin doesn't tackle like that if it was real," and he goes, "So there's something going on that's not exactly," but he was like the only one. Everybody else was just like, he went for the eye. Oh my God, that's what Kevin would do in a street fight. This has got to be real.
Well, I'm going to get to the guy. I know who the first guy was in WCW, said it out loud that he figured it out. But let me talk to Liam for a second. Liam, you interviewed, obviously. And by the way, you got to get this book, Crazy.
The book
Like
is
the Fox.
awesome. The book
it's
is awesome.
Incredible.
Yeah.
You have a lot of nerve writing an accurate book on wrestling, young man. Who the fuck do you think you are? But at any rate, you interviewed a ton of people about Brian. In retrospect, what's the impression you got? How many people thought it was legit when Brian and Kevin and Eric were doing all this?
It's funny because in talking to different people, over the course of time, people with the benefit of hindsight and retrospect and the fact that they all want to be the smart ones. Say, well, I kind of spotted this, and I think I might have said it to somebody at the time. I think that when I talked to Kim Wood, he said he thought DDP was saying after the fact that he thought he kind of was starting to put it together. But the impression, honestly, is just like everybody bought it because it was such an elaborate production. How could it not be? Like he was going out of his way to do things like when the whole bust-up happened with the Booker Man situation, he was going out of his way, like we said with Dave, to not talk to people that he would talk to all the time, but went out of his way to talk to people that he didn't talk to, typically speaking, and was telling them, look, there's a disagreement with the Booker, I'm probably going to end up in a new place. So like he was going out of his way to kind of spread the word that way so it would filter down to the people that he knew, like Dave and other folks like that. So it was, in terms of who really figured it out, the only one that I really heard was the one that you're going to mention.
So I want to make one quick reference because it was actually here at Caesars in the middle of all this, and it was the night of the Heenan thing, so the night of the Clash of the Champions. So I'm at somewhere in this giant place, right? And Brian sees me, and Brian comes up to me and just goes, just go with it. Okay, and I'm not a performer, and I never do anything like that. And then Brian just goes off on me in the lobby at Caesars. I mean, just going off on me, right? And, you know, there's people, the one I remember is Gary Juster, but there were a bunch of WCW people. And then Brian leaves and they go, oh, are you okay? We're so sorry. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know what got into him and everything like that.
Well, the first guy that I ever heard verbalize it was Disco Inferno said backstage, oh, they're working the boys.
Right, I do remember that one.
And it's amazing that a man who now manages a strip club just down the road from here could put two and two together like that. You can see him, by the way, Sapphire Gentlemen's Club right down the road. Ask for Disco.
Oh, is he working?
See, Brian will be there later. But that's the first time. Now, I want to ask Brian Jr. a couple questions here. Brian, when you first off, you've watched all this stuff, right? You've gone back on tape and DVD and YouTube. You've seen everything your dad's done that we're talking about, correct?
I mean, I've seen, everything. Obviously, his work is so vast. When you look at the grand scheme of things and all the different acronyms and promotions he's worked for, there's just so much content out there. But yes, I've seen most of everything we're talking about here.
Now, what's your impression when you see stuff like that? To see your dad do this stuff that's so wacky and so creative, and he looks out of control, but he's in control. I mean, it's like a how-to on how to pull something off. It never really got done before, and it certainly is never going to be done again. Once Brian did it, it guaranteed it wouldn't be done again.
Yeah, and it's funny you say never be done again, because I think at that time in history, right, he was kind of pushing the boundaries on reality and what's real and what's not. But I think, we're seeing a lot of that parallel today and what's going on, especially with AEW. And I see a lot of my dad, a lot of people compare him to Dean Ambrose, but hell, the other night, the whole locker room, nobody was told that he was going to be there. I had no idea that John was coming out. So even I was worked in that aspect. And I see a lot of my dad in Cody and in Kenny and Jericho, obviously, too. So a lot of what he, laid the groundwork for and how our business plays out and stuff is being, rehashed and reused today. Not so much specifically, but just in how we, work the boys essentially, and how we get the smart fans invested in our product, is we add another layer to it, right? And we add a layer of believability, and I think he laid the groundwork for that.
Now, what do you observe from your dad's career that you think you can apply to yours? Because he was such a unique performer.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think he worried too much about what the acronym was. What didn't matter if it was WWF or WCW or NWA or this. He was always working at a high level. He was always being himself. And at the end of the day, he didn't take no for an answer. Whether it was size or this or that or politics. At the end of the day, I'm not, trying to be on this one squad. I'm not trying to be for this one team. I'm trying to be myself. I'm trying to be Brian Pillman Jr. I'm not trying to be my dad. I'm not trying to be Shawn Michaels. And I think that's the ultimate key to being a great performer, is just being yourself and truly believing in yourself. So,
Boy, you have a lot of your dad's mannerisms, kid. You're freaking me out. I mean that in a good way. Kevin?
Can I
Thank you very
interrupt
much.
both of you guys? Don't you think one of the things that he did that had never been done before, and you just said it can't be done again because he did it, we were using inside terms. When he said Booker Man, no one had ever allowed that there was a man behind the curtain manipulating the whole thing. And then when I broke the pencil and said the pencil's broken, there won't be a pencil in this one, people say, well, even the ones, and Disco believes in flying saucers that are flying above his strip club every night. But he only charges you $15 to get on the roof to see it. And I'll tell you what, it's a pie plate and he spins it. But I think that was one of the things that you can never do it again, is because Brian exposed it. And because he exposed it, it made it real.
I totally agree. You could not possibly put it better.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as an addendum to that, I think it was quite interesting in 2010 when CM Punk did his thing, which was very much Pillman inspired, I thought, with the great promo on the stage, and it got over tremendously. It got over in a different way because it was like, I don't think that anybody truly questioned and truly believed the way they did with Brian. It's almost kind of a bit of a play-along thing, but because it is so unique and it was so interesting and different with Punk because it's breaking conventions that have been set in place, it was still interesting and it still kind of got the buzz amongst the same community of fans that Brian did. It just didn't have the same bite because people couldn't question it the same way because it had been done.
And the other thing is, that's a great point. And the other thing is, everybody knows that Vince would have gone to black or a commercial, but this is another thing that I just thought of while you said that. We would do, Dave, you guys remember when we used to do spots for towns?
Right.
Brian would be off in another tangent, and we'd say, we can't use that. You know, he'd be cussing on the interviews. And we'd have to say, okay, Brian, you're through for the day. Go ahead and do another interview. And they're saying, the guys are saying, they're not going to waste that much tape. You know what I mean? Or manpower or something.
Or time, yeah.
Yeah, and manpower. So they're thinking, even the guy, he worked the guys in the truck. He worked everybody. And the way he did it was, like you said, when, not taking anything away from Punk, I enjoyed it, but you knew Vince could have pulled the plug any time. Well, they were pulling the plug on Brian back then, so everybody thought, well, they wouldn't be doing this.
That's right. And
It was that's the thing. It was one more layer from the Punk thing. The Punk thing was the surface, but with Brian would think, okay, if it was real, they'll pull the mic or they'll cut the mic off, so we have to cut the mic off and make that thing work.
here's how, Dave, you said that Brian went through a period where he didn't call you because he was trying to, keep you out of the loop on the work. Here's how he hit it for me, because like I said, we talked every day, and sometimes the conversations would be real brief. And here was a typical thing during this period. He'd call and he'd go, so what do you think about something happened? And I go, and I'd give my opinion, and then before I would ask questions, he would go, oh, wait, my wife Melanie's yelling at me, I gotta go. And then in the background, you'd hear Melanie, I'm not yelling at you, shut up, Melanie! Click. Brian, one thing I have to ask too, obviously your dad's career had some ups and downs, some good and bad. Is part of his life a cautionary tale for you? Did you learn anything in that regard?
Absolutely. I think wrestling in and of itself it's a very high risk, high reward career choice. We're going out, we're traveling, we're putting our bodies on the line for the people and for the sake of that pop and obviously making a living and going out and being a huge star. And I think ever since he was young, he always wanted to be a big star. He always wanted to be a big guy, and being a smaller guy in the wrestling business, there was always a lot of drive for him. There was never a complacency. He was always going. And I think when you're going 120 miles an hour all the time, at some point you got to put the brakes on it. And I think the brakes just came, at the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was probably a time where he probably should have taken some time off and recovered and let his body recover. But again, like you said, he's looking for a bigger contract. Everybody's always in the landscape of wrestling today is so hyper competitive. We have access to things like social media, things like YouTube, and anybody can get over in an instance. Anybody in this crowd could get over in the wrestling community, and then next thing you know, you're showing up at the conventions, signing stuff, and I'm in line for you, right? So, in any sense of the game. He was always going forward, and I think my biggest thing I take from that is to just take care of my body, because obviously his body was deteriorating at a rate that he couldn't control, and obviously to stay away from some of the demons that haunted the boys back in the day, and I think a lot of that's a lot of that's been weeded out in today's world. I think a lot of guys are a little bit more mild with their partying and with their abuse of substances. So, yeah, there's plenty of lessons to be learned from my father's career, not just in the wrestling ring, but also how we conduct ourselves as professionals on and off the road and stuff.
Very well put. Now,
Can I say one thing?
Sure, Dave, go.
It came right up from him. Brian would have been the king of social media.
That's what I was just going to say.
Brian would have been the king. He would have been the biggest pro wrestling star of social media. He would have been a social media phenomenon.
Yeah.
And he would have gotten in early, and he would have manipulated it to a degree that nobody else would be able to. Jericho was very much copying. I mean, I think that's the closest one is when Jericho and Kenny Omega did the thing before they actually did the angle at the Tokyo Dome. And that would have been the role. That would have been Brian's role.
one being the elite obviously ties right into that
But
as well.
that's different. Being the elite's all tongue-in-cheek and fun, and they're the kings of social media in a sense of. But Brian would have been completely different. The closest, like I said, would have been the Jericho before they did the angle with Kenny Omega, where he's just doing these subtle things, and people thought, you know, you can't really be the top guy because you've never come to WWE, or what you've done in Japan doesn't count. Japan's minor league, and people were really pissed about that. And Brian would have been the guy who was doing those little what's gonna get people in the gut, and what's gonna get people really, really mad, and I'm gonna go there and hit it in a way that they're gonna believe it. And but yeah, he would have manipulated that to an incredible degree.
Now, before we get back to the timeline of Brian's worked shoot, obviously, I'm sure everybody here watched it or live back when or saw it on tape since then. How many of you bought that it was legit? Because, like I said, I talk to the guy every day, and I couldn't figure it out. How many of you bought that it was legit? Just yell or clap or whatever. How many of you had it figured out? Well, there you go. And that is all the people need to know, as Baron von Raschke said. Now, then Brian actually got fired by WCW, by Eric Bischoff, on the premise that he'd come back after doing the loose cannon shoot gimmick wherever. Now, Kevin, you were obviously, privy to that. And I don't want to say it was a dumb move, but how could you believe for sure that he'd come back after you fired him? I mean, it just...
Let me tell you something.
Because it made the shoot complete. It made it into a shoot, but Brian did that to get the best offer, and that enabled him to get the best offer.
Let me tell you something. When Brian, like I said, he said he used to call you at all hours. He used to call me at all hours too, and I'd call him at all hours. And when he told me that, I said, wow, he's taking this to the bank. He's not coming back. He ain't coming back. And I've heard stories, and I don't know if they're true, that at one time he was getting paid by 3 companies. I heard we were still paying him, trying to get him back. You'd have to ask Eric. When he went to CW, Vince was subsidizing Paul then, to a degree, and I think he was getting some money there. And he worked it. When he told me that he wanted to be fired, I said, good for you. I knew where he was going with this. And anybody that dedicated their life and came up with that, because all you guys out here are wrestling fans. I'm a wrestling fan. Everybody on the stage is a wrestling fan. And Junior brought something up about he wants to be himself, not his dad, and I think that's the most commendable thing. And he's going to be a huge star. And you're going to say, I was there when I went to the talk and when he talked about his dad. But Brian overcame every obstacle. He had, 32 throat operations?
Yeah, he had a real bad throat problem, and it
was
really never really fully corrected.
Brian was one of the few guys I ever worked with in my life that I saw eye to eye with. He wasn't a giant, but he kept his body in shape. He projected larger than life. But when he told me that he was going to work getting fired, I said, I don't think this is a work to myself.
Well, William,
This may be off topic, but you're talking about just how seriously he took being in shape. But I did a little tour of England a couple weeks ago, or what was that, a month ago or whatever. I just so happened to have wrestled this asshole too in the tie back here in the corner. But anyways, I got the chance to have dinner with Scott Hall because I was with Cody Hall over there. We were doing some shows together, his son, and Scott told me that my dad would go to buffets and get pasta and stuff. He'd take the pasta to the bathroom and wash it underneath the sink to wash off the grease because that's how intense he was with his dieting and with his body and stuff. So just a little tidbit I thought I'd throw in there.
Well, Liam,
Real quick, let me just jump in on one thing. So that's the one thing Brian did in that period when he was doing that. So he told me about, okay, this is the plan, and the plan is that no one's gonna. He goes, no one's gonna believe I'm fired unless I get the office to believe I'm fired. So I have to really get fired. And he goes, and you're not gonna report that I'm fired unless I'm really fired. And he's telling me how he's doing. So I go, Brian, they're never gonna buy it. And he goes, no. He goes, this is how I'm gonna convince him that we have to go all the way with it. And so then he goes, they fired me. And I go, no. And he goes, no, I mean like termination papers, everyone in the office knows I'm fired.
yeah, he got the FedEx gimmick and everything.
Yeah, right, so he was like fired. But I mean, the thing is that, so he was looking, the firing was to then create the bidding war between WCW and WWF, but he was always wanting to go to WCW. I mean, this is the real tragedy.
You mean WWF?
Wanting to stay with WCW?
Oh, he always told me, we were always, I won't say fighting because we weren't fighting, but I was always going, go to WWF because Shawn Michaels was closer to your size.
Right.
And the other side, they got Hogan.
Yeah.
And WWF was behind at the time. And they're going to need someone, and you're new, and you're hot. Whereas with WCW, there's all these guys on top of you. And he's like, no, WCW, I can get guaranteed, because WWF was doing guaranteed contracts.
Right.
They started, but it was like, I want to get that. It was always, I want Luger money, because if I have Luger money, they have to push me because of the size of the paycheck. Right. And if they push me, I'll make it work. But if I don't get in this situation where they have to push me, I'll be, in the middle. So that was the whole thing. But I was always going to go to WF, and he was like, no. And if he did not get in the Humvee wreck, I'm 90% sure he would have stayed with WCW.
I think that was a strong possibility. I
think the Humvee wreck changed everything. It came at the worst
time. It really
time.
did. It really changed his life, changed his career, changed
everything.
What he did that moment. Liam, when you researched the book, what was your impression? What was Brian's intent after he got fired? You talked to a lot of people that talked to him.
Yeah, so I think this, ultimately the entire thing, and this is one of the things that Kim would really want to beat into my head, was like, it was all theater. It was such an awesome piece of theater, and it was artistically fantastic. All the stuff he was doing in ECW with the promo with the pencil, and there were so many unique things that he was doing, but it was all, in the end, as good as it was artistically, it was about the money. The entire thing
was about feeding his family. It was all about feeding his family.
The thing you'd said to me, I have 5 kids. I have 5 kids. I have to have big years.
I have to have 3 big years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So to me, that's it. It was like, I think his whole plan was get hot, and then the bidding war's on. And I think he would have gone to the highest bidder. I think it would have been as simple as that.
Oh, he would have. But I mean, Luger was the name he always would bring up to me. I mean, and I think it had to do with something, I think he wrote about this. Like this would have been, when he first got into WCW, and Luger was on top and Brian was kind of in the middle, and Brian was out trying to learn lucha moves with Conan. Yeah. And Luger just kind of like looks and kind of like laughed at him. And Brian was like, this guy's making so much money, and he's like laughing at me. And I was a better football player than he was, but he looks like he's a big football player. And it was just like, it was always, I don't want to say he was obsessed with Luger, because he wasn't at all, but it was his goal was to, he always used
that was his benchmark.
Yeah, it was always, I want Lex Luger money, and I want Lex Luger's push. And if I get Lex Luger's money, they'll give me that push. And if I get in that spot, I will be a bigger star than Lex Luger ever was. Because, and I don't want to say anything bad about Lex, but Lex was always projected to be bigger than he ended up being because of how he looked. And
From the time he went to college.
Yeah, even in college football.
Yeah, my friend was the assistant coach at the University of Miami.
Oh, you probably have a similar story to me.
Yeah, and he told me that he was at the school because of potential, and I'm not knocking Lex.
Yeah,
he was paid for potential.
Well, he washed out at Miami and at Penn State. I mean, he couldn't,
Well, I remember, and I don't know, I don't even remember the name, but it was a coach at Miami, so it might have been the same guy or another guy in the staff. But I remember the story where it was, like how was he already become a wrestling star by this point? It's like, how was Lex as a college football player? And he goes, he was an All-American in the weight room. That's what I'll say about his football playing.
Well, and it's funny too. Getting back to Brian being fired, when I heard he got fired, and by that time I knew what was going on. And when it got to that, when I heard he got fired, I was like Dave. I said like slack-jawed gaze. No, how'd you pull that off? But in retrospect, it doesn't surprise me because Brian could talk people into anything. He was so smart and articulate, and his ideas were good. And so it like.
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
His ideas were brilliant.
Brilliant. That's
And that's
you're right. I'm understating.
No, and I don't mean that you're understating, but that's how he talked people into it. I mean, when he came up with me with the idea, immediately I said yes. You know what I mean? He could have sold me a live cobra, and said, "Oh, it's okay. It won't bite," and it bit my face. He just knew how to talk to people, get his own way, because what you said, he struggled his whole life to overachieve
In every aspect.
Yeah.
From I mean, we're talking all about wrestling, but when you start as a kid, and we all know all the high school.
Oh yeah,
football
Brian was
stories.
5'11", 227, and he made second-team All-American. The first-team All-American at Brian's position, which was nose tackle, was Refrigerator Perry, who outweighed Brian by 120 pounds.
Yeah, but I mean the whole thing. I remember.
And Brian was probably the better football player. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't beat being 125 pounds ever, but in terms of actual performance on the field, Brian was top of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at his funeral when they said that he was. When Brian was in high school, and Brian's one of the greatest high school football players in the Cincinnati area. There was a book like the 100 greatest high school football players in Cincinnati, and Brian's in the list of all time. But when Brian graduates high school as like an all-state football player, he was the only member of the all-state team not to get a scholarship. So he had to go to Miami of Ohio as a walk-on, and he ends up as an All-American there. And then he was the only All-American not to get drafted by the NFL because he was too small to play in the NFL, and he did make the Bengals and when he went to camp, it was like, well, it's Cincinnati, he's kind of like a local high school favorite, and he played college here. We'll let him in camp, feel good story, right? There was never, Kim Wood told me this, there was never a chance he was going to make the team, but he just killed people in practice, and it's like, how can we cut him? And then he got the Ed Block Award. Is that the award? The Ed Block Award for the most courageous player, which the players themselves voted for him in his rookie year.
Yeah, as I was going to say, just on the football point, in terms of just being an exceptional player, to give people a perspective of just how good Brian was at the position he was in, he was so good by his senior year that he was being like double teamed and triple teamed in his position, like as a priority all the time.
And he was tiny for that position.
And he was tiny for that position, and still he set the record for tackles for loss that still stands to this day at Miami of Ohio, especially like career tackles for loss at like 77, like tackles for loss yards was like 346. It's still the all-time record at Miami of Ohio in his position. He was a guy who, when as a walk-on at Miami of Ohio, they said to him, maybe you do this. He's like the 8th string middle guard when he went there. And they said, well, maybe if you work really hard, you might make the traveling team by your senior year. And he was so good in practice, he made the traveling squad in 3 weeks. So 3 weeks was all it took to go from 8th string middle guard to you're better than the senior that we're starting right now. And then obviously his legacy, he was an absolute monster in Miami of Ohio.
By the way, the one thing I wanted to add about Brian getting fired, in a way, it didn't surprise me what had happened because that story I told about the press pass at the Super Bowl, Brian wasn't far from getting that press pass from me. Because I was thinking, I could say I lost it, and they'd give me another one. And then I'm thinking, oh, shit, they all know I know Pillman. This will never work. But he was close to getting it, and that's how persuasive, and again, like Kevin said, how intelligent, how good Brian's ideas were. One thing I want to bring up from WCW before we move on to a little bit about Brian's, and by the way, all of you will get to ask some questions later. We'll get to that, a Q&A in just a little bit. But WCW, my favorite tag team of all time is the Hollywood Blondes. Flying Brian, let's hear it. Flying Brian and Stunning Steve Austin, and it was just marvelous, wasn't it, Kevin? I thought those guys were just at the top of tag team wrestling for the entirety of their union.
And nobody gave this idea to Brian. This is what we're talking about. And everybody up here understands that the small things you do make the big things. When he used to come out behind Austin and have the camera rolling, that was him. Yeah. That was him. And nobody came up with that gimmick. And to me, they were a great tag team. And getting back to the thing about Luger, it's being in, you know, a lot of you wonder why sometimes back in the day why guys weren't pushed. There was the North Tower that were the bean counters. And I know Eric isn't going to come out and say this, but I know for a fact that one time one of them came over when one of the younger guys we were trying to push beat someone with a big contract on TV. And they said, explain this to us. So I think that was Brian's goal too, that he was going to be the guy. And there was going to be nothing to stop him. And I actually think that he could have drawn with Hogan. He was so much hotter than anybody at the time. So it didn't matter who you put him with, he would have drawn money.
Oh, no question. And I thought that the Hollywood Blondes were just tremendous. And that was during a strong era for tag team wrestling. You could get pushed, a legitimate push as a tag team guy. And I thought that was broken up prematurely. But it's worth noting, and Liam, this was very evident in your book, that was the start of a lifelong friendship between Brian Pillman and Steve Austin.
Yeah, absolutely. It was I think it was a real learning curve for Steve in some ways, because I remember we talked about this before. As good as Steve was, he was still relatively new in the business at the time. He'd only been
He's only in it like 3 years or so.
3 years, and he was ridiculously good for 3 years, don't get me wrong, but it was just a thing of, and I think that he's even said it himself, that Brian was the guiding force of the team, and I think a lot of that came from the fact that when Brian got into the business in Stampede, he was paired with Bruce in Bad Company, Bruce Hart.
Yeah.
And I remember Bruce told me directly, like when they were trying to form the team, they were trying to form Bad Company, that Bruce was, who was the booker at the time in Stampede as well, he wanted to do the big picture stuff, but Brian loved details. He loved working on the details and trying to make the team have an identity and a look and the music. And he was just very conscious of the overall presentation, the overall production type of a thing. And it was the same thing with the Blondes. When they were paired together, they weren't paired together to be the Hollywood Blondes. It was just, here's Brian Pillman, here's Steve Austin. We don't have a lot else for them at the time. WCW got their tag team division. They kind of waved a little bit because they messed around with the belts and they were just comparing singles guys together a lot and things like that. But it was a matter of they put them together, they got chemistry, like incredible chemistry, like ridiculously fast, and then it was just working on the gimmick, and it was just the look, the vest, the tights, the chain, the way they would do promos, the way they would do the little things like the camera and the stuff like that, and it made it an act, and it was like a whole product, a finished, polished product that looked like they were going to be the stars for the future.
You know, another thing on that team, when the team was first, because it was actually the office that put them together. I forget who the booker was, but
I think it was Dusty.
Yeah, it was Dusty. Okay, Steve was against it because Steve was a single star and he thought the tag team would take him down. But Brian, immediately, Steve changed his tune. But when he first heard, it's like, what are you doing, taking me from U.S. title level guy into the tag team? But then afterwards, he was, they were Steve was totally with him. And I remember with Brian, one of the first things he did was, you got to get me tapes of Stevens and Patterson. And I go, they don't exist. They don't exist. Because he had, whatever it was, he had heard the legends of Stevens and Patterson. And that was the team, the Blonde Bombers. That was the team that he wanted to copy. And I go, Brian, I go nobody taped that stuff in the 60s and 70s. But I remember that. He goes, we got to get tapes of Stevens and Patterson. That's what we got to copy. And because no one, the one thing about the tapes of the guys from that era is it was a whole new generation and no one would have seen what they did. But Brian, however, in the business, people had told him about Stevens and Patterson as a heel team, and that's the team that he wanted to be.
And Brian was very good at watching older tapes and taking stuff that was just out of the consciousness of the current wrestling fans, that was just long ago enough, and he would update it. And he would come up with some really interesting variations. Brian, I know you talked to Steve Austin. Talk about some of the things he said to you and what your relationship's like with him.
Steve is he's been pretty much the first person I kind of spoke to about getting in the business. The first early sign that I really wanted to do this was when he reached out to me on Twitter. I wasn't even considering becoming a wrestler at the time. I just had seen something that Steve Austin had said. I retweeted it or whatnot, and then lo and behold, I got a DM from Stone Cold Steve Austin. I'm freaking out. 2 million followers. I'm like, oh crap, this is wild. And he's like, yeah, I got this weightlifting belt. I'm gonna give it to you. It was your dad's. It says flying on the back. The Cardillo weight belts. A lot of guys are still using Cardillo to get belts made. So I was like, all right, great. So if that was any sign to at least get back in the gym and put that on and just see how I feel athletically and look into getting into wrestling, then that was the ultimate sign. And since then, I talked to him about. Or after that, I talked to him about, where I should train and stuff, and he put over names like Les Thatcher and guys like that, and that were in the area. But I really wanted a very modern, comprehensive take on this business today, and that's what ultimately led me up to Lance Storm School. So, I talked to Steve about that. Hey, thank you. Put over Lance Storm. Greatest trainer in the business. Wouldn't be here where I am now without Lance.
I love Lance too, but let's not tell people he was applauded. Not tell him, I should say.
No, but I talked to Steve about the book, and Steve really enjoyed the book. I think everything he read it, cover to cover, everything in there he says was true, or at least in his knowledge was. I think there was very little that he disagreed with on that. And every now and then I send him some footage, specifically, some MLW TV stuff, and he's always kind of been an open ear for me.
Now, I want to fast forward. Brian eventually did sign with WWE, but that was after the Hummer wreck. Yeah. And he was never the same after the Hummer wreck. And I don't just mean physically, although he did have to have his ankle fused, and that obviously limited his performance. But I think even more damaging was Brian took such great pride in his work that to not be able to work at the level he was accustomed to really mentally hurt. And I would talk to him about how upset he was just about the quality of his work had deteriorated. Well, those were his words, not mine, because I always said, listen, you're so over on personality and on the mic, you barely need to work. And he just didn't buy that. He wanted to be at the same high level, and that was very tough. And Kevin, Brian obviously was an exemplary worker, and after he got hurt, he was in WWE, and I thought he still did great, but he just didn't see it the way I did.
First of all, I agree with you, but we'll go to Brian's side. You had a fight from the day you were born, 32 operations in your throat. You're told you're too small to play college football. You're too small to play NFL. You're too small, you can't get over. He finally grabbed the brass ring, and the brass ring broke. And he put pressure on himself, like you said. He could have gone out and created something like this, and he would have been over. But he wouldn't have been over with himself. And Brian was the kind of guy, and we all know this is true, he wasn't going to do anything 90%. It was 110%. Balls to the wall, or he wasn't satisfied. I think one of the things about him is that when you have to overcome all those obstacles, you have to keep on achieving. And then I think he brought it on himself, that what you said, Mark. I think that's true, that he brought it on himself, that he didn't think that he was giving the people the Brian Pillman. And he was over. It didn't matter at that time. It's like I tell these guys, they do all the moves, and this is the best generation of wrestling of all times. But Dave, when The Rock lifts up his eyebrow, the show's over, right? And Brian was that caliber of guy then. Brian didn't have to do all that stuff anymore.
Yeah. I think a big thing with that too is that as much as Brian was, like I say, he succeeded in life by through talent. His talent overcoming things when he felt like the talent wasn't what he wanted it to be. And that was more than anything else. It was two things. I think it was like he badly wanted to be a top guy, like a true top guy, and he saw this as like an impediment, and he's got to fight through it because he always did. And it's one of the things that's kind of, for me personally, was interesting in doing the book, was seeing things like in the Bengals minicamp where he's trying to make the NFL, when he gets injured on the third day of the minicamp, tears his hamstring, and he's just so bound and determined to succeed that he just is icing it, and he's trying to prepare, and he goes back on the field too early, and he collapses again, and his hamstring's not ready, and on and on and on. It's like, it's a story of his life. He so badly wanted to succeed that even when his body would send him messages, he'd just head down, barrel through. And the other thing too is he'd gotten the deal from WWF, a really good contract, and I think there was a lot of guilt from him in the sense of earning his money, feeling like he was earning his money and not having the contract and coasting. And I think maybe the perception of other people of him in that regard too, I think kind of weighed on him.
I think so. I think that's, exactly what happened, because I remember the conversations I had with him. And again, he really shouldn't have been wrestling at all in the ring. I mean, I would hear this.
Or at least taking a much more significant period of time off.
Or more time, at least more time off. Because, I mean, I remember, he would talk to me about playing softball. He could hit the softball, and he couldn't run to first base. Like, they use a pinch runner for him. And it's like, then how are you wrestling? Like that. But I go like, why don't you just, and they would, they gave him a shot at being an announcer. And I go, why don't you be an announcer and heal up? And it's like, my contract's X amount of money was $300,000 or whatever the number was, I think it was 3. But it was like, I'm not earning my money as an announcer. And I go, you've got to get healthy. But it was like, in his mind, it's like, he didn't want to be, like you said, getting a handout. He wanted to be earning that money. And, again, and his goal was he wanted to be the top guy, and sitting as an announcer, he wouldn't be. The funny thing is that the longer he could have been like Roddy Piper in Georgia. Right. The longer he was as an announcer, by the time he finally did the angle to get him in the ring, it would have exploded. But he had that guilt about, I'm being paid to be a top guy. I've got to perform as a top guy. And the ankle was just giving him so many problems. And that led to other, you concentrate on protecting the ankle. When you work, you change the way you work and change the way you take bumps. And then that was going to lead to other injuries because he wasn't doing things properly at that point.
Right.
Compensate.
Now, one angle I want to talk about was the home invasion angle with Steve Austin, where Steve Austin shows up at Brian's house and Brian pulls a gun. Okay, now I have to ask Brian, you were about 3 years old that night. Were you there?
I was there.
You were there.
I was in the house.
Dave, hand him the mic, please. Hand him the mic, please.
I was screaming and crying. I didn't know what was going on, and I would assume it was the camera crew or some of the young boys came upstairs, and I guess they forgot we were in the house for it. They were like, "Everybody stay up here." But yeah, I mean, you hear your glass break in your back door, and you wonder what the hell is going on. Maybe a few rounds were fired. I don't know. So a couple gunshots, and next thing you know, it's big time TV stuff going on. So I don't know. I was so young. Everything. It's kind of something I told Dave before. Everything that always went on, it was always, oh no, it's just for this, and this. So when it came time that my father was announced dead, and I don't mean to start tear jerking, but I thought it was a work. I'm thinking, oh, yeah, my mom's sitting here crying. And I'm like, she's been through this TV stuff before. She's just going through the motions. So it almost didn't settle in with me for a long while that my father actually wasn't coming home, because I was so accustomed to that TV kind of coming in and quite literally invading my home and into my life. So
that's an incredible story. But boy, the invasion angle. Think about this: your 3-year-old Brian Jr. Uncle Steve shows up at the door, breaks it down, and your dad pulls a gun.
It's another Saturday night at the Pillmans.
That's exactly right. It's a typical night at the Pillman household. Now, it's funny, too, because, again, this is what made Brian so great. And we're here to tell how great he was. This is just another reason. That gun angle, everybody knows it's an angle. At that point, the shoot work's over. It's obviously a work. It was totally believable. If you knew Brian, or even if you're watching on TV and invested in Brian's character, you could absolutely see him doing that, Kevin. Am I right?
Yeah, and if you, at this time, you knew it was a work, but it was watching The Godfather. It was that well produced. You had Marlon Brando, you had Pacino, and you bought into it. You didn't realize there was a camera, because he had built that character of the loose cannon. You're saying to yourself, even guys in the business are saying, did they go too far? And Randy Savage once said to me, what is too far? And I thought, well, people said they went too far, but we all pop for it to this day. So what I would like to think, what Brian would have done after that to top it, and he would have.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's funny what people remember so vividly. Because remember at the time, Brian and Steve really wanted that to be the thing that would break through, because this was the time when the NWO was running amok, and they wanted something to break the malaise on Raw. And Brian and Steve were both so gung ho, weren't they? On this will be the thing that breaks the ratings. And the story that you told me about how they wanted every detail possible, about every demographic. The next morning, yeah.
Well, it's the next morning. Brian calls me up and he asks me about the ratings, and I go, I won't have them till like 1 my time, 4 o'clock Eastern. So he calls me, at 4:05, and every demographic, women, 18 to 34, men 12 to 17. He wanted every demographic, every minute, which I got at that time, and just going through who had hit the most, who had hit the least, and trying to analyze. And ratings, it's almost impossible to analyze that much detail. But he wanted to know everything about, what worked and what didn't work, and who it worked with and who it didn't. And the funniest part was the angle worked the best with older women. You have the book probably. Yeah. I remember when we were going okay, so it's like some sort of a captive thing or whatever. We were trying to figure why did it work so well with the older women compared to other demos? But we were trying to just go through all that. But yeah, he wanted to know everything about that angle.
I talked to Brian the day after as well, and he goes, "So, what do you think of the gun thing?" And I just said, being a smartass, "Was it a real gun?" And he goes, "Yeah." Then, "No." Then he goes, "Shit, should have used a real gun." Now, I thought Brian had a great run in WWE too as a member of the Hart Foundation. And I know
that.
Brian enjoyed that very much because he thought Hart Foundation and New Hart Foundation, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I think, and Dave, I'm sure you'll agree, Brian always seemed to think that being in the Hart Foundation gave him great gravitas and credibility, even more so because he was the token crazy guy in the Hart Foundation.
Yeah, so the funniest story about the Hart Foundation is that when they first putting it together, and Liam, you know this, I talked about this to you, he calls me up, and Brett's got this idea that we're going to be baby faces in Canada, and we're going to be baby faces in the UK, but we're going to be the biggest heels in the United States. And Brian is just like, Brett's lost his mind. He goes, we got to be heels everywhere. It's the same TV. And Brett was, because of his Canadian business, Brett was insistent they had to be baby faces in Canada and work this angle. So anyway, and Brian's like, we've got to be heels everywhere. We've got to be strong heels everywhere. So the night of the Calgary show, when they come out, and they're like the biggest baby faces in the world. And it was almost like last night. I can see a lot of similarities between last night and what happened in that Calgary Canadian Stampede pay-per-view show. He calls me up after the show and he just goes, Brett was right and we were wrong. And that was the greatest night of my career. And it was just a couple minutes before he died. But he goes, this is the greatest night of my career.
One thing I want to get to before we go to Q&As with Matt Kuhn, and I mentioned this earlier and I want to run it past everybody here. I think Brian Pillman absolutely should be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Let me hear what you think. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I think it's kind of a fake-ass Hall of Fame, but I would like to see Brian get recognized at that level. I think he's very deserving of that, so hopefully it happens. William, what do you think? Let's go across the board here.
Yeah, to be honest, it is one of those things where it's a Hall of Fame. For what that Hall of Fame is and for what it's trying to accomplish, I see there's no harm in it whatsoever. And more than anything else, I think that he should be acknowledged for. It's why I wanted to write the book in the first place, because I think he's a fascinating guy, a fascinating career, and by that standard, I think he fits. Absolutely.
Kevin, your thoughts?
He changed professional wrestling.
There you go.
Anybody that's that innovative, he needs to be in the Hall of Fame, period.
Dave?
As far as influential on the business, he was more influential in business than most, so yeah.
Let's ask Brian. And Brian, your dad would probably think it was real cool if you said, no way, no way.
Well, I think there's a reason we're all sitting here today. There's a reason we're on this stage, still talking about his career to this day. There's a reason that the Hart Foundation took him under their wing and trained him in Calgary. There was just something about him. There was a lightning in the bottle. There was something very special about his career. And even to this day, I'm very blessed to say that I'm taken in by the Hart family, and that pedigree and that legacy lives on. And to think that I grew up when I was like 12 or 13 years old, I thought I would have no chance in this business. I thought all of you people would have forgotten about him because he passed away and all that. And just to see just how far and into the digital era of memes and GIFs and just how influential he is. And like you said, he would be such a mastermind of social media today. He was way ahead of his time. Something we forgot to touch on earlier was that he was actually involved in social media before social media, and that was through the AOL AIM Messenger chats, and a lot of people were involved with that. And he was getting his fans riled up. He was working people through that too. So he was ahead of the game before the game was even the game. So I think there's clearly a big, wide open banner available for him in the Hall of Fame.
That's right. I agree. You like doing the Hart Foundation thing, don't you? That kind of brings back a little bit of deja vu, I think, for you, doesn't it?
Just working with the Hart Foundation?
Doing the Hart Foundation in MLW.
I'm very blessed just to be with a guy like Davey Boy Smith Jr., someone who's truly mastered this craft and just a true combat specialist, and Teddy Hart, obviously someone who with more of a lucha background and stuff. Just we have so much fun, and it's very organic with what we're doing on MLW, and I can't thank MLW enough for giving me that next level of exposure. If it wasn't for them, I might not have been here at Double or Nothing, and I might not be sitting here right now. So a huge shout out to the new Hart Foundation and MLW.
Can I interrupt you?
Oh yeah, and obviously Kevin Sullivan
No, I'm just going to say one thing.
took a cane to the head
You guys don't know
and bled.
how close this guy is to being loose cannon. I had the pleasure of doing an angle with him and Teddy. And we were in a hallway, and Teddy, Davey Boy Jr. gave me a super kick, and my head hit the door. And he took a cane and swung the cane over my head and hit the door. 4 minutes later, a SWAT team surrounded the building
Very
and
true.
came in with guns.
True story. So they had thought because the cane was made of ceramic, and obviously I'm working it, so I'm hitting behind Kevin's head, but he's so good at this, he gets color at the exact moment. It looks amazing on screen. If you watch it on MLW, you can see it. But there's the sound of the cane hitting the back of the door, and it actually exploded and shattered. The patrons of the hotel thought it was a gunshot. They thought there was a shooting at the building. So I'm sitting there picking up the pieces, and of course his blood's all over the ground. It looks like a murder scene, and like 20 cops come up, SWAT team. I'm like, damn it, I'm screwed, And then we bring them upstairs. We're like, no, we're shooting a TV show, and they're like, oh, so it's fake blood? And they're like, no, it is real, actually, real blood. So. But that was a true story.
All right, we got Matt Kuhn over here. Let's take some questions. Put your hands up. Tell us who you are and where you're from, and we'll do your best to tell you what you want to know.
We've got some great questions out here. Give a big hand to this panel, guys. What do you guys think of this panel? What's your name and what's your question?
Jeremy Ivins from Miami, Florida. He was an amazing athlete. I remember watching him through my high school and college years. Besides you, Brian Pillman Jr., who in 2019 would you have loved to see Brian work with that you would have just said that would be a 5-star match?
Who, me?
I'm sorry, come again? What was the question?
He would like to know who today you would like to have seen your dad wrestle to perhaps create a 5-star match.
Oh boy,
okay.
Who did Brian not get
In
to
his
wrestle?
prime.
I don't know. That's a tough one, isn't it?
But I mean, I think he's talking about people that are active today.
Okay, yeah.
Active
That are
today.
active today? I don't know. I mean,
Yes. Someone active.
We'll all give our inputs on this. I personally was. I think there was a story when my dad was forming like a new horseman clique. He was going to bring in Jericho. So I think Jericho is someone who's also had a pretty active take in my career and has helped me out. And I think I would love to see them wrestle. I think Jericho is one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. And
I'd like to see
him and
that.
my
How
dad
about you
go at
guys?
it.
And by the way, one thing we kind of skipped over, Brian, we mentioned the Hart Foundation. Brian was thrilled to death to be in the Four Horsemen. He thought that gave his career such credibility. And just to be even, he talked to me, I'm in the Four Horsemen with Ric Flair. Ric Flair. Brian Pillman and Ric Flair. And he just was so impressed, not with himself for being there, but just the opportunity. Brian wasn't that full of himself. Brian was a guy who appreciated opportunity and certainly made the most of it. But Liam, didn't you get that impression with the people you talked to that Brian, I always thought Brian was the nicest guy in the world to deal with, and I heard nothing different from people in wrestling.
Yes, that's kind of one of the things that made my whole process wonderfully easy is that when I just mentioned that I actually wanted to do something to honor Brian, everybody was so ready and willing and wanting to go out of their way to give me their time because they wanted to tell me stories about you. Well, but I mean, he was just such, he had such a charm to him that so many, I mean, again, not to be too much of a downer, I remember Kim saying to me that his funeral was so sad because all these people from all these different walks of his life from various different times, everybody had such fond memories and so many great stories and things like that. It's like, yeah, absolutely. And on the Flair point, I think that the Brian Pillman and Ric Flair and being in love with the idea of being a horseman, he didn't grow up a wrestling fan, which is an interesting thing. His appreciation of Flair came from just research and study of Flair promos, because when he was in Stampede and he kind of realized, I'm going to have to be a good talker to do this. He loved watching Flair promos. He would watch Dusty promos all the time. And I think when he finally got to the point of working with Rick, he worked with him in 1989 too, and they had the match on Saturday night, which was a huge hit. And I think the way he actually finally rose up and in his own mind maybe was like close to being on Flair's kind of par, being in the Horseman, I think it meant the world to him.
When they did the Flair for the Old skit.
Oh, those were awesome. That was awesome.
And everybody remember that Flair for the Old?
Yeah.
Brian said to me, "Do you think I went too far? But that's Ric Flair." I go, "No, you did good." Next question, Matt, where you at?
And we have a question from Lance.
I got two quick ones if I could. Brian, much respect for you. Big fan of your dad. What are some principles that you live by in terms of blazing your own path in your career as you're early on in your career? And also, Liam, for you, this story obviously was one of the richest stories that you could possibly tell, and you did a hell of a job with it. What else is on your radar? There's so many other great stories in wrestling that you can tell.
Brian, he wants to know what's your basic philosophy of wrestling, correct? What he's trying to do this early in his career.
How's he blazing his own path?
Well, I'll tell you the most
Big
important thing
footsteps.
in wrestling, and it's always being on time. That's a good one. I was trying to be here on time for this panel here, and promoters and everybody appreciates it when you're at the venue early and you get in the ring and check out the turnbuckles and the ropes, and you're there and you're ready to roll. But one of the most important things too is just knowing your worth, and really it was very hard for me, obviously, coming into the business with sort of a mystique and a name to it. So I couldn't just go wrestle for anybody. I couldn't just take $20 and go have a match. I really had to respect and even when I was up training in Calgary, Lance was telling me you can't just go out there and do this. You really have to respect your father's name and do that. And that's one of the things I have that's different than most guys breaking in the business right now. But a lot of those principles are just knowing your worth, staying in great shape athletically. A lot of that could be considered lost on people today, as far as when you look at the past and just how much more serious people took their nutrition and the way they looked. And when we're on TV, everything is just amplified, right? Your looks amplified, your tan, how you look. If you're fat, you're going to look fatter on TV. If you're ripped, you're going to look more ripped. So it's one of those things. Is we're here to be stars, and a lot of guys today, they are not treating themselves as stars, and they're not going out there and being the one sought after. They're reaching after the other promotions, or they want to work for people. So it's all about knowing your worth, really, and staying at the highest level, whether it's conditioning or in shape, and obviously studying. We have a vast array of ways to watch film and just little gifts online. Every little bit counts, and when you are absorbing information on whether it's on your phone or your laptop all throughout the day, there's no reason that 90% of that information should not be wrestling related. If you are, in fact, a performer in the business or a fan at all, there's just so much content out there going back in the past, whether you want to look at some old school lucha or you want to look at some All Japan or something. There's just so much wonderful content out there. There's never been a better time than right now in 2019 to be a wrestler. So I'm very, very happy about that.
Yeah, just on that point, before I answer your question really quick, I want to take a second, even though he just called me an asshole about half an hour ago, to put Brian Jr. over a little bit, because I think that one of the things that I love watching about him on MLW, and last night was exemplary of this, I thought, just looking like a star. Yeah, when you came out. Which, it's the gear, the hair, you're doing things to stand out. And it's like, I think that's something that's sorely lacking from especially in this country. In this country, it's like, I think it really kind of stands out, and I think it's a great thing.
Can I just
Please.
agree with you? A guy that made his living in sports, sports journalist. Has soccer uniforms changed in the last 50 years? No. Soccer uniforms.
No, they're the same.
Have football uniforms changed in 50 years?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Little bit, yeah.
Gotten better. Baseball uniforms changed?
Almost exactly the same.
Okay. Hockey?
Almost exactly the same.
Okay. Boxing?
Same thing, trunks and gloves.
UFC?
Same thing.
Wrestling? They're going with long underwear to the ring. He's a star. People pay to see stars, not guys that are going to Walmart in their underwear.
Well, I'm going to sound like an old stick in the mud when I say this. One of the things that, since wrestling lost, boy, this is away from what we're talking about. When kayfabe died, it gave the idea that anybody could do it, and maybe it's not a good idea that anybody did. You're still supposed to look like a star, and Brian Pillman Jr. definitely does. Next question.
We have got a question from Jason.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. This seems kind of obvious, but what do you think Brian's opinions or ideas about the rise of AEW in this new boom period we seem to be in for wrestling? Would he have his own company by now?
What are my opinions on it?
What do you think Brian's opinion would be? I mean, it seems
Oh, my
obvious he
father's
would love
opinion.
it, but like,
Yeah, like I said, I see a lot of parallels with what these guys are doing with AEW, and also what my father was trying to do, and how he was trying to approach the business, and just really giving the people something that they can truly be invested in, right, and not just, for lack of a better term, just shoving shit down their throats. You know what I mean? He really wanted to give people a truly captivating product, and I think that's what AEW is aspiring to do. And all the moves they're making, and it's like I said, they kayfabed the whole locker room. Nobody knew that John Moxley was going to appear, so of course I'm jumping out of my seat when it happened. And when you get everybody, when you get the whole locker room, when you get the whole community invested in something, in a brand new company, and I can't see the future. I can't say what's going to happen, but man, it does look bright.
Well, that's Brian's father talking there too, because Brian was very much into the backstage camaraderie, and even when he did the shoot angle, everybody pulling the same rope. In fact, he thought that's what made that so great, was he wasn't pulling the same rope like you're supposed to in wrestling. We left Liam a question behind. We ignored the question before. Liam, wrap that up.
Yeah, so I don't want to be rude. I was just going to say that I think in terms of what would be another interesting character, it's really tough because this one was a culmination of years and years and years of collecting notes and collecting tapes and stuff like that, just because I was interested myself in his story, because I thought it was so fascinating. So I think it'd be tough to find one that would compare to this. But I really think Eddie Gilbert's a very interesting character that I would love someone to be able to put something together to really tell that story. I think the only thing that kind of starts me is that I really don't want to get into the trend of writing about kind of tragic figures. But I think at the same time, he's a very, very interesting figure that I think should be spotlighted.
You know, I want to say this. I think that Brian, and I talked to you about this once, I think Brian would make an absolutely fascinating movie character. Like a movie on his life. Yeah.
Absolutely. And
I mean, like,
who better to play him?
What do you say? Fighting for my family too?
Well, if Brian would have been here last night, I think he would have jumped Brian Jr. from behind and said, "Brian Pillman, there's only one Brian Pillman. Fuck."
I was just going to say, it's funny you mentioned that, because when this first came out, I had a bit of interest from a talent agency in Los Angeles about trying to do something with this. And in the end, it's just like it's been going back and forth, who knows. But it's just like, to me, it absolutely belongs on the screen. Because it's part of the reason why I do it in the first place. The book was like, it's such an incredible tale that it almost feels like it takes something of that magnitude to capture the different elements of what made him what he was.
By the way, Dave and Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong here, but Brian's conversation-ending word when he was just thoroughly discussing it was "fuck." That long shot, fuck. Next question.
We are all the way over here to your left, gentlemen, and we have a question from Chad.
Hey guys, when you think about today's environment in WWE, do you think Brian, it's so scripted and it's so corporatized. Do you think Brian would have been able to thrive in such an environment? Do you think he would have been able to practice his art the way he wanted to?
Yeah, because Brian just wouldn't have listened.
But he would be frustrated as hell, though. Yeah. He would. he'd figure out a way to make it, but he would be frustrated as hell in this environment. Just like we talked about with Dusty. It's just like someone like that with that kind of creativity. I think that when your words are handed to you on a piece of paper, it just, because Billy Graham was another one who told me, I couldn't get over it. And he probably could, but it's like it would be tougher for sure.
The last time Terry Funk was on their TV,
He told me the same thing too.
Terry said, they handed me a script, and he took the script, rolled up in a ball, and said, you don't have to tell me how to be Terry Funk. I've been doing it for 70 years. So I don't think, Brian Pillman would have made the best out of a bad situation, but he might have been able to talk Vince into him being the only guy not to be having scripted interviews.
Well, it's like Lance always told us at training when it comes to the Federation or the WWE, it all depends on who you are. And there is 1,000 standards on who you are and what your abilities are, what you can get away with and stuff and what the rules are. So I think obviously he would have probably had a different set of rules than somebody coming up, fresh into the NXT or something. He would have had a lot more freedom. I think guys like Jericho had a lot more freedom with what they could say and what they could do.
It wouldn't shock me if he were running someplace like NXT, if that was his job at this point in his career. Or actually, I think if Brian were still alive, he would have been here in some capacity last night. I just think the way that probably would have trickled down. How are we doing on time? Because I can't see past the lights to a producer.
I think we have enough time for one more question from the audience.
That's the cue I was waiting for. Let's go to one more question.
Wrapping you guys up there. We have a question from a young man from Winnipeg. What is your name again? Derek from Winnipeg. What is your question?
My question is for Brian, and my question is, it's a two-part question for Brian, then also for Dave Meltzer. First off, by Brian, an amazing match at Double or Nothing. Let's give him a round of applause, please. And the question is, what would your All Elite Wrestling dream opponent be? And for Dave Meltzer, what's the Meltzer report? What's the star rating on Double or Nothing?
I'm going to go home and watch the tape of everything because I wasn't really watching it like that. I was actually hanging around with my sons and a couple of friends, and we were just kind of. I have put it this way: my gut says that Cody and Dustin will be the highest rated match, but just because of the emotion and everything like that. But I couldn't give a number until I go home and rewatch everything.
Well, it says a lot about the show and that match. That brother versus brother almost never works.
Almost never works.
And that worked.
Yeah.
That definitely worked. Kevin, were you surprised by that at all? What did you think when you heard it was brother versus brother, and what was your reaction to it?
I grew up with Dusty. I knew they were doing this for their father. I knew this was the only one that could work because they were going out and laying their emotions and love for their father on the line. The Steiners couldn't do it. Nobody else could do it. And I'm glad that you said that there was the best match in the card because there was a lot of people, a lot of non-believers knocking that match.
A lot of people thought,
knocking it very hard.
Yeah.
And I'm glad they're choking on their words today.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for being here to pay tribute to the life and times of Brian Pillman. I also want to give recognition to Conrad Thompson for organizing this because he did just a terrific job, and I'm thankful to him for. This is the first time I've worked in wrestling in any capacity since Diamond Dallas Page got me fired back in 2000, and had to slip that in there. Is DDP here somewhere?
He's around here somewhere.
Okay, DDP Yoga, great stuff. Actually, it is great stuff. And also Tony Schiavone, who's masterminded this. He's the hardest working guy I've ever been around. A pleasure to work with him again. And everybody up here as well. Dave, who I've known for years, Kevin Sullivan, who put me on TV. Like I said, blame him. I was very grateful. Liam O'Rourke, who wrote just one of the best wrestling books ever. And Brian Pillman Jr., who I believe a lot in. I'm telling you, he's going to be a star. So thanks to everybody, and there is more StarCast coming up.
All right, Mark Madden, thank you very much. Great panel and a great final day here of StarCast 2. We have had so much fun, haven't we? That's right, you can yell if you want. You're wrestling fans. Come on, say yes. Got to lead them on sometimes. Nevertheless, we still have to come. A House of Hardcore with Tommy Dreamer, that's still to come. We also are going to have Dustin Rhodes come out and do his podcast. And I'm going to tell you, after what happened at Double or Nothing last night, there's a lot that he has to talk about, and I know a lot that fans have to talk about as well. Stay with us here on Fight TV. We have a whole lot more here in Las Vegas of StarCast 2. And of course, this is part of the Double Nothing Weekend.